Good morning to some and good evening to others. My thoughts are with those who have been affected or know somebody who has been affected by the shooting in Tulsa, Oklahoma yesterday. It has been a particularly difficult day, but also a very difficult past month with the mass shootings. My name is Erica Quach, and I am a Senior Program Officer at the National Committee on U.S. China Relations. Thank you for taking the time to join us for this very important conversation. We will begin with a moderated panel discussion and from there turn to Q&A from the audience. And with that, I now turn it over to tonight's moderator, Professor Maggie Lewis, who is not only a professor of law at Seton Hall University, but is also a Public Intellectuals Program Fellow with the National Committee. She has been instrumental in fighting against the China Initiative, as well as pushing this conversation and many others forward at the committee. Maggie, it is truly an honor to have you moderate tonight's program on the future of U.S.-China scientific research collaboration. Over to you.
Thanks, Erica, and always a pleasure to do anything I can with the National Committee. So we have three fantastic panelists in only an hour, which means I'm going to keep my opening remarks very brief. As many people who are listening in today know, on February 23rd, the Justice Department officially ended the China Initiative and replaced it with what is being called the Strategy for Countering Nation-State Threats. However, there are lingering questions about the extent to which the initiative's emphasis, for example, on using criminal law to protect research security, is going to continue under this new strategy. In addition, of course, the ending formally of the initiative did not erase the societal costs in terms of a chilling effect on the pipeline for foreign talent and even the retention of foreign talent in the United States, as well as it did not erase the costs on individual researchers and their families that are still happening from the lingering effects of the China Initiative. And for that, I highly recommend, if you haven't seen it already, to watch Steve Orlands' interview with Professor Yangyang Cheng of MIT, which is available on the National Committee's website, and I think will be dropped into the chat as well. However, today our focus is on where are we today with U.S.-China research collaboration and also giving thoughts for the future direction. I am joined first by Yangyang Cheng, a physicist and a writer who is currently hanging out with lawyers. She's a scholar in law and a fellow at Yale Law School's Paul Tsai China Center. Second, Stephen Chu, a professor of physics and of molecular and cellular physiology at Stanford Medical School. He is the former US Secretary of Energy and the co-recipient of the Nobel Prize in Physics in 1997. Third, Eileen Guo, the senior reporter for features and investigations at MIT Technology Review, who has done extensive work on the China Initiative, for which I am very grateful. So kicking it off, I want to go to Dr. Cheng. There was a strong response from a number of groups to the China Initiative. We had academic groups, scientific community outside of academia, legal advocacy groups like the ACLU, a number of AAPI advocacy groups. And as we look to trying to shape future policy, I'm wondering if you just kind of reflect on what we learned as far as what were the encouraging aspects of those efforts and what are also some of the limitations.
Thank you so much, Maggie. Professor Lewis, as I should refer to you. And thanks so much for the question. And I think, and as you mentioned in the introduction, I'm a particle physicist by training, and I got my legal education from the best TV lawyers, and now I do work at the law school. So between both worlds and with a lot of discussions with my former colleagues and my current colleagues, I think one of the most encouraging aspects coming out of the response to the China Initiative is the political organizing that's come from the academic community. And in particular, many of them are first-generation immigrants and scientists coming from China with a very similar background as I did. Some may be from my parents' generation, some from my generation. And many may have taken a relatively passive or laid-back approach towards US politics and just politics in general, and thought that their work is somewhat secluded from politics. But now through the political developments, many have organized open letters, have collaborated across disciplines and across universities, and collaborated with civil rights groups and other kinds of community organizations that have reached beyond academia. And I think this is really a moment of political awakening for a lot of immigrant Chinese academic community and also just scientific community in general. And I think that is a very encouraging aspect. With that said, I think anyone has an entry point into political activism or advocacy, and that entry point should not be seen as something that is isolated or has a singular cause, but should be placed into a larger and longer history and gain a more contextualized and capacious understanding, especially when something like the China Initiative that is really so complex and there are multiple intertwining causes behind it, and sometimes it's being collapsed into a singular narrative or being tokenized in a lot of the discussions as well. Of course, there is the racial aspect of it, but that of course is not new. This is one of the founding principles of this country, or even before the country was founded, since Columbus lowered his anchor and praised God. And of course, in the contemporary context, a lot of the persecutions and suspicions towards ethnic Chinese academics in the US also very similar to what is being placed, say, on the Muslim community after 9/11. And then related, but a separate issue towards race and racialization is academic freedom. And of course, that has a long history that's not just limited to science and engineering, but there is a lot of connections with what some of the limitations, the government surveillance and persecutions on the social sciences and humanities, including right now with regards to teaching of history, of critical race theory. And before that, also, of course, in terms of learning Arabic languages and Middle Eastern studies after 9/11. And then the history of academic freedom over the past century or so is closely connected with state pressure as well as corporate interests, which brings me to my third point with regards to the China Initiative and some of the root causes. That includes the privatization and commercialization of academic research, as well as the securitization of academic research, including how states are seeing science and scientists as strategic assets and placing scientific research and academic exchange into this great power competition narrative. So I think what is really important at this moment is not something like during this pandemic, we like to say going back to normal, but there is not such like a reversal of some policies or some kind of idealistic past that we can return to. There are geopolitical forces at play. There are also these trends of emerging technologies that have ethical and social consequences that academic communities and society at large need to contend with. So the path forward should really be rooted in what kind of future we as humanity, as a species, want to live in, and then think about our individual roles and what are the causes and effects in terms of the individual actions and policies and what each person can contribute to, can play.
Thanks. And I want to pick up on this thread about this is a much longer issue than just the China Initiative, which started in 2018, about the view of people from China and have some sort of Chinese heritage. It goes back, of course, to the McCarthy era, and even earlier than that. And so here, I'd love, Ms. Guo, if you could, in your research and your colleagues' research, you tried your best to make a data set of China Initiative cases, which was not easy because the cases were not stamped as China Initiative cases. But in the data set, a striking number, it was, I think, about 90% of the defendants were of Chinese heritage. And for that, that it might, that was just such a high number that, any explanation by the FBI and the Justice Department that there was no bias or prejudice was hard to swallow. But yet when Matt Olson, the Assistant Attorney General for National Security, ended the China Initiative, he recognized the perception of bias, but was emphatic that he found no influence of bias in any decision-making whatsoever. So that would include implicit or unconscious bias. And there also, though, has been conversation about what should the Justice Department and FBI do to have sort of bias mitigation training, but more generally, and this was a question we got about diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts going forward to try to make it so, like Dr. Cheng said, we change in the forward. We don't just try to revert back to a pre-China Initiative period.
Yeah, so it was 88% of defendants that we found when we looked at 77 cases that were of Chinese heritage, which is, as you said, really a very high number. And This week, actually, the Office of the Director of National Security put out a really long awaited report looking at privacy and civil liberties of people of Chinese origin and how they're affected when the intelligence community, including the FBI, investigates threats by the PRC. And again, what they found was that there was no discrimination based on race or national origins. They did acknowledge that there could be a disproportionate effect, but that was based on conduct. And so it's kind of the same narrative that has been repeated through the years during the China Initiative and also before the China Initiative. Back in 2015, when Dr. Xi Xiaoxing of Temple University was erroneously accused of sharing not classified, sorry, but proprietary material with Chinese companies. One of the end results of the activism at that point in favor of Dr. Xi, who was ultimately the case was dropped. It was, the FBI had gotten its science wrong. But one of the outcomes was that DOJ promised that it would implement implicit bias training. And that was moving forward until 2018 when the Trump administration paused it all. And so this report that just came out, it again talks about the importance of this kind of training for the intelligence community. I asked a spokesperson if any of it has actually gone forward at the Justice Department, and I didn't get a response. And all this is really, it's important because as we've been talking about since the end of the China Initiative, there's this lingering question of, is this an actual end or is this a rebranding? And some of the issues, as Yangyang was speaking to earlier as well, is there are these cultural issues at play. And within the Department of Justice, unless there are more cultural and structural changes in how they approach investigations and bias, it's really hard to see how scrutiny of, in this case, people of Chinese heritage, but really it could be anyone, as already mentioned, it's really hard to see how it's going to stop in a sustained way. What we might see is that there is more caution in this year or another 2 years because of this big political issue that the China Initiative has become. But as we've seen in the past with Dr. Wen-Ho Lee, with Dr. Sherry Chen, Dr. Xi Xiaoxing, and during the McCarthy era, it's these cycles where this scrutiny comes back. And so I think that's really important to look at as we move forward.
Thanks. And so given these pressures on the US side, there's questions about how much space the US is going to allow for collaboration. But at the same time, in his recent big China policy address, Secretary Blinken said that Beijing is pursuing asymmetric decoupling, seeking to make China less dependent on the world and the world more dependent on China. And of course, we've seen Beijing welcoming STEM talent. And so I wanted to turn to Dr. Chu. And so on what extent are you seeing this pressure to separate or decouple coming from the United States and or China? And are there different pressures from different sides? And sort of what's your take on who's shutting the door?
I would say that it is very asymmetric. The agents, some of the agencies in the U.S. government have explicitly told its scientists there's going to be no more collaboration where there used to be collaboration just a few years ago. This is particularly the DOE. NASA has actually said we don't want you to collaborate years earlier than that. And certainly, understandably, the Department of Defense didn't want anything that had anything to do with national security and collaboration. Very understandable. But what is happening is that world-class user facilities that are open to everybody, CERN is the most famous example of a user facility, open internationally to all comers. You submit something and you form international collaborations. ITER, another one, which has China, and China is in CERN and in ITER. China is now developed a number of world-class user facilities, a very large radio telescope and the US one, which was old, had finally crumpled. And yet scientists have said, we don't want you to use that. They've created the world-class hard X-ray laser in Shanghai Tech, which Department of Energy employees saying, we don't want you to collaborate. Not only that, we don't even want you to go to meetings or help be on selection committees, things of that nature. So that seems to be very one-sided relative to what I see in China, where I've never, when they have meetings, when they have things, they try to engage me or others. I don't see any change in their attitude and in scientific conferences. Now, so going back to what prompted Tony Blinken's question and to pursuing asymmetric decoupling to make China less dependent on the world and the world more dependent on China. So I can understand in certain things, semiconductor dependency. China depends on a lot of chips designed in the US, even though they may be made in China. And there's a lot of IP connections in that. And so they feel very vulnerable when the United States says, we're not really sure. We want to let Chinese companies use these chips. And so I see that as a response from China. It makes sense that just as the United States and Europe doesn't want to look to China as the major supplier of batteries for electric vehicles. And so I think that has something to do with it, but it's separate from scientific collaboration. I think these are two different worlds of interdependency or independence, or at least not being vulnerable in critical supply of materials or parts or things in the commercial world versus what you want to do in science. And the major foundation in science is someone has an idea, publishes it. It's in the open literature. That spurs someone else to have an idea, publish it, and you just bootstrap up. And this is the driver of science. And the United States is not the sole owner of all the most creative stuff that is happening in science in the world today. And for us to say, start to close doors where European countries, Japan, Korea, Australia, other countries out of Europe are not doing this. I see it mostly penalizes the United States.
That's so helpful. And so Dr. Cheng, as the other, not just scientist, but physicist on the panel, I'd be curious first if your observations are similar, and also this issue about, there's going to be guardrails, right, in the US and probably in China too. It's not just open science, take anything you want, cross borders. Do you have any thoughts about, how to kind of create those guardrails that there are legitimate national security issues connected to research and development, but still allowing space for the strength of having great minds across countries collaborate?
Yeah, that's such a great and question, but it's also really difficult and complex. And then I think one word that a lot of US policymakers like to say is like, the Chinese policies lack reciprocity, that our openness is not being reciprocated. And I think that is a really interesting statement to make as a justification for closing doors, because if openness is good, then just because maybe the Chinese government is not implementing similar measures doesn't mean that the US government should imitate. And then I think in terms of openness or not in China, it's a complex thing. Of course, like Chinese government and society is a different type of political system, and we shouldn't draw false equivalencies between authoritarian society and the political system here. And in general, because of the nature of the political system, there are more restrictions, and the Chinese society has never had a kind of open immigration policy as US has. And with COVID-19, there has been a lot more restrictions. And so the Chinese society is not necessarily sealing itself off from the rest of the world. That is not correct. But the government is certainly increasingly using the border as a tool for political control in terms of the flow of people, commerce, as well as ideas to an extent. And that is a reality that needs to be contended with. And then, of course, a lot of international students who are studying in China now are barred from re-entering the country, and that is a very serious issue that needs to be acknowledged. Of course, none of these are justifications for the US government to take similar measures. However, I think it is also important to acknowledge, as Professor Lewis, as you mentioned, like scientific collaborations also it's not a universal good. It's not even neutral. Like science by itself is not a universal good or neutral. It is social and it's political and its consequences. So there are scientific collaborations cross borders that raise ethical questions. One that is more specific and easier to understand is, for example, there are US-based scientists who may have collaborated with Chinese entities, including Chinese state security, in terms of devising these genetic surveillance tools or facial recognition tools or other types of biometric surveillance tools. And these are, of course, harmful, and this kind of work is wrong. But I think it is not enough to simply say, oh, we'll bar these kinds of collaborations. The more important question to ask is, why would there be US scientists who have this ability to collaborate with Chinese state security in the first place? Why is this work being pursued in the first place anywhere in the world under any kind of political system when this technology can cause harm? And so that is one aspect. And that is actually similarly almost like the easier question. The more there is a broader question with regards to the nature of political systems and complicity in systems of oppression. And I think Dr. Chu mentioned CERN, which the European Center for Nuclear Research, where the Large Hadron Collider is located, where I spent over a decade of my physics career. And it's facing this very acute question with regards to Russian invasion of Ukraine. What does this collaboration do with regards to its collaborations with Russian scientists, and more particularly with Russia-based Russian institutions that are funded by the Russian state? And so there are similar questions that can be asked with regards to the complicities in just by this nature of collaboration alone, or is a tacit approval of the certain form of governance? What kind of atrocities does a government needs to make for this kind of collaboration to be no longer ethical? And of course, this is not a black and white answer, right? Of course, scientists shouldn't be penalized just because of where they were born or their citizenship either. But these are questions that cannot be evaded either, and these needs to be asked. But the more important question, the more important baseline is the answers cannot come from simply erecting a border, because systems of oppression as well as harms and risks from emerging technologies cannot be contained by an arbitrary political boundary. But we need to contend with our positions in systems of oppression and see our roles in it.
Yeah,
Can I make a comment about that? I see it perhaps a little bit, maybe simple lens of what Yangyang said. Regard to Russian scientists at CERN, my view would be, unless these Russian scientists are actively supporting Putin and his regime, right? If they're completely apolitical and they're not known to be a Putin supporter, I don't see why one should say to Russian scientists, you're no longer invited to be there. And it's in the deepest, darkest part of the Cold War in the 50s, and during the missile crisis, during Kennedy's administration, where it looked like, not only looked like, in hindsight, it was very close to nuclear war. The back door of negotiation were the American and the Russian physicists who trusted each other, and they were able to lower the temperature. And so this is something where, again, if there's a scientist who's outspoken advocate of invading Ukraine or supporting Putin, that's different. But if they're just physicists, and they themselves could be perhaps as equally horrified as we are about what is happening in Ukraine, then to start this and say, well, everybody's casting the same, it does remind me of this reaction of Japanese internment of third generation Japanese not being trusted, third generation Americans who are Japanese heritage being interned, not only second generations.
That is a great plug for people-to-people relations, which of course is foundational to the National Committee. And I, as someone who's so saddened that Fulbright China doesn't seem to have any hope of being restarted soon, but that we need to have communications across various groups to try to keep the wheels on the relationship. So I'm interested from the journalist of the group that this idea about that the United States is going to have to continue to hopefully evolve, not devolve, in its policymaking as new concerns arise with different kinds of research and relationship with China. But one of the themes of your work across areas is government accountability and transparency, and not just with the China initiative. And so I'm wondering, first of all, we got a question about this FBI statement about the 2,000 investigations, or more than 2,000 investigations, which we've heard now for several years, and yet 2 more investigations are being opened every day. How can you as a journalist, or how can other groups try to increase transparency and accountability, and maybe just even a little bit about is the different roles of the scientific community that we're hearing from, the academics, the journalists, as we sort of chart a path forward to have as hopefully at least a policy that dials back the China threat rhetoric and focuses on what are sort of real, legitimate, identifiable national security concerns.
Those are really great and really tough questions. So let me see where to start. I think what's been really key to change and some level of accountability in regards to the China initiative has been the activists. The scientists themselves, the activists that have come up and supported them. They're really the watchdogs that have been saying from the beginning, when I think in 2019, the first cases were MD Anderson had several professors and researchers that were fired, and that news came out. And so I think as soon as that happened, there was this mobilization. And speaking to Yangyang's point earlier, like a lot of that mobilization actually first started among activists that had been that had come together when Dr. Chen and Dr. Xi Xiaoxing had faced their legal challenges, and some of them had come together even earlier to support Dr. Wen Heli when he was imprisoned. And so I think the civil rights groups, the scientists, the academics that are speaking out and will, I think, continue to speak out, I'm certain, are really the front lines and need to continue to do so, and have been doing everything really well. The one thing that I'll add from journalism is, I think my job is really to question everything. All of the statements that are put out, the facts that we believe to be facts, the statistics even. There's a commonly cited statistic, I think it's, actually I'm not going to try and remember because I'll get it wrong, but there's a statistic about how much IP theft is actually originates from China every year. And where do these numbers come from? Where do these things that we take as facts come from? I think is a really important question. And in terms of the narrative of the China threat, I think one of the really important things and lessons from journalism that I think is applicable everywhere is to think about whose language are we using to describe these kinds of issues, and whose agenda does that language serve? And going back to the crux of our reporting, is, on the other hand, what if we do adopt that language for a moment? What if we do adopt the perspective and hold the government accountable to its own statements? And that's really where we started with our reporting and building out this database. What if we looked at the China initiative from the government's goals of actually combating economic espionage and national security threats? And to the question in the Q&A, that's tough, not always possible. The question about 2,000 new cases that are underway, with 2 new cases being open per day, I think there are going to be challenges in finding out some of the specifics, especially when counterintelligence or national security is involved. There's always just so much more secrecy. But I think even bringing up the question and continuing to bring up the question is important. And then the final thing that I would say to policymakers, and if there are any on this call or that are listening, I think one of the fundamental concerns that's really at play, and Dr. Xu spoke to this earlier, is really about the US fear of losing the innovation race. And I think what we're not doing well and need to change is making the US a better place for research, for innovation, and that's a policy issue. That's an issue of how much basic research is being funded, what we focus on, of course, openness, as we're talking about here, but also it's an issue of immigration policy and how easy do we actually make it for people to come and to stay and do research. And these are things that we're not doing a very good job of.
so much in there. So and I'm starting to weave in questions, and please, people who are watching, put your questions in the Q&A. And so thinking of the policy response, because there's many layers going on at once. So we have action in Congress, and we got a question from Kylie, who's a member of AASF, Asian American Scholars Forum. Highly recommend their work. They're one of the groups that was created because, unfortunately, of this focus on security threats and research in China, and they do great webinars. But he brings up that we have both the America Competes Act, which is an acronym, and USICA coming from the House and the Senate, and the reconciliation process is underway with approximately 100 members of Congress sorting through thousands of pages of legislation, which includes language, for example, on talent plans, one draft called the malign talent plans from a certain country, but there's action by Congress. Simultaneously with that, we have OSTP, the Office of Science and Technology Policy in the White House, that is working with a whole bunch of the three-letter grant-making agencies, NIH, NSF, DOE, keep going, on research security under NSPM 33, the National Security Presidential Memorandum 33 on research security. So there's a lot of action outside of the lawmaking in Congress, but with respect to rulemaking, trying to hopefully streamline and clarify grant reporting requirements across different agencies. So there's a whole mess going on. So I'm wondering if maybe one of our scientists can speak to sort of where in this whole mess do you see points that you think are worthwhile and should be pushed through, is either actual law or policy, and which parts of this conversation do you find perhaps more concerning and something that hopefully won't make it into the final version?
Well, let me start. I think there's a great heterogeneity in this issue being the knowledge that the Chinese government does want to still intellectual property rights. It's mostly commercial. Of all the cases being opened, think of the number of formal charges that go to trial rather than the Justice Department dropping them. There's just a handful. If you listen to Christopher Wray, there must be 10,000, several years ago says 5,000 cases open. Opening a file doesn't mean there's any there. And most of the cases in academia versus industrial spine, in academia, most of the cases, they devolve into a gotcha, you didn't declare something, rather than evidence of real export of information before it was ready to be published, or confidential information or classified information. So there's this big mismatch between this rhetoric and what actually goes to trial and is being formally charged, that I think we have to really be conscious of. What is it driven by? It's driven by China's first emerging as an economic competitor, and the government cooperating with unscrupulous economic competition. Okay, but the competition itself, there was an anti-Japanese sentiment 30 years ago when Japan was rising as an industrial power. But now it's compounded by the fact that China's becoming a Cold War adversary as well, due to the actions of the Chinese government. Principally, I would say that's also not symmetric. But this is being convolved with academic professors, Chinese American professors in the United States, as being now under suspicion. And that's the part that's scary. So are all the Russian American professors going to be under suspicion because of Russia's incredible behavior in their invasion of Ukraine? That would also make no sense. It goes back to some of the other statements that were made earlier. There is a racial undertone as to who you're going to pick on as well that's going on.
Yeah, if I may follow up quickly on this, and I think with a lot of these legislations that, of course, there needs to be a reconciliation process, and of course, different legislators were slipping in their own China-related agendas, like COVID-19 origin search, and then how that would affect scientific collaborations between the two countries, and this and that. And so that is a really concerning aspect. But I think overall, I think an underlying concerning aspect is how state-centric these narratives are, and that partly relates to Eileen's point earlier, this language, and the language reflects a certain way of thinking, and how the language of the state, which means the logic of the state, is being assumed as axiomatic, that science and scientists are being seen as state assets and state interests, and how this kind of national interest and national competitiveness, which inevitably assumes that there is something like the border as a tool of political competitiveness, as a filter for people, for bodies, as a ranking of professions, and as a tool of racial capitalism. And that is extremely harmful. And that is actually a very intellectually lazy and logically inconsistent way of thinking, and is ultimately morally indefensible. So I think it's really important to shift this narrative from one of artificial scarcity to one of abundance, to think of people on the other side of an artificial division as our kin. And from that standpoint, I think it is also very important for, like, power does not yield power without pressure. So it's not necessarily so much about how we convince any individual policymakers, but how as academia we can organize and leverage our own power as the primary site of knowledge production and knowledge dissemination. There is a very critical function that academia plays, and only academia plays, and similarly for journalism as well. And as Dr. Chu mentioned earlier, for example, during the height of the Cold War, there are individual American scientists and European scientists who pushed their national governments to open up ways of collaboration and communication with Soviet Union scientists. And I think so what are the bills and laws that are already in place is one thing, but it's another to say how much how much of these policies are justifying state surveillance and state pressure on academic activity, and how much the academic community shouldn't yield this part of self-governance and freedom to the state.
Yeah,
one of the things I think,
oh,
one of the things that I think Congress and many people who are not scientists don't understand is, suppose you're a professor in the United States, and I have Chinese graduate students, I have Taiwanese graduate students. And if I got the impression that before we were ready to go public or publish, that somehow information was going over to someone in another institution, and forget about whether it's China or any other place, this is not good. and if there's a significant amount of that going as being suspected by some members of the FBI, one would know about it. Okay, and because it's self-preservation. We want to publish something so we can get the next grant, and so this is being confused as though these professors are kind of helping this information go out. No, it doesn't work that way, and we would be very alert to that if there was evidence that, oh my gosh, we were thinking about that a year ago, we didn't let on what's going on here, and now all of a sudden, there's a few percent, maybe 10%, maybe less, maybe more, I don't know, who have scientists who are somewhat unscrupulous and want to find out what people are doing before they're ready to share. Okay, but to say that this is cast in this country especially, or this ethnic heritage especially, doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah, and here I would applaud the work of Representative Judy Chu and others at CAPAC, the Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus. I know she's actually on the conference committee, really trying to make it so the language that gets baked in is not, again, fueling this idea of the other threat, but instead trying to focus on, where should we have some understandable limitations and guardrails on collaboration, and what are we trying to protect. And also just going back, there was the question about IP and the amount stolen. So Mark Cohen at Berkeley, wonderful, has written about the $600 billion echo chamber, because there's this number of $600 billion of IP theft annually. But of course, there's big questions about, what do we count as a U.S. entity? How do we take that number? How is it calculated? So I recommend his work on this as we try to not just throw around big numbers and then have them become self-reinforcing by adopting that government language. So we've got a bunch of great questions coming in. I'm gonna, first, we had one from Jeff Lehman at NYU Shanghai, which I think we've largely answered, but I think it unpacks some of what we've been doing, that the China initiative mushed together classified research security, proprietary commercial research, and basic science as a collaborative public good. Having done so, it understandably went on to equate espionage, commercial theft of IP, and research misconduct. Rebecca Kaiser at NSF commissioned the Jason report, which seemed to point in a healthy direction of treating those three domains differently from one another. Is there any sign that a pivot in that direction will take place? So I think we've started unpacking that there's a lot of different things going on here, but I want to put that out there. And at the same time, a question which is important to all of humanity, anonymous question put in that facing such a dismal environment in U.S. China relations, do you think there is much room for collaboration in areas such as cancer research or other areas where human health can benefit? Or are these areas that you expect will be curtailed even more? And of course, I'd add COVID, monkeypox, you name it, to that question about huge health issues. So any of those, if anyone wants to jump in, as we have about a little over 15 minutes left.
Yeah, so maybe I would tie in the part about cancer research to the earlier point about IP, right? And then I think it is really interesting how much the public are talking about intellectual property and access to biomedicine because of the COVID-19 pandemic and how disappointing the outcome is. So I think one thing that is really important to understand is that laws, as we discuss in society, they are not like the second law of thermodynamics or something. It's not like immutable. And they are made, and they're social, and they're political, and they are made for a certain purpose. And a lot of our current understanding of commercialized technology are actually very, very new. In terms of how proprietary it is and what are the restrictions in terms of access. And a lot of things that the US government is accusing Chinese entities of doing in terms of like stealing technologies or stealing talent. The United States, when it was newly independent from Great Britain, also broke a lot of immigration and export control rules in Europe in order to acquire advanced technology and technicians. And so in that context, a lot of times IP enforcement is correlated with a level of economic development more than the legal traditions or political systems of a country. And that is something to understand with regards to China now as well. But more importantly, the fundamental question is something cannot be stolen unless it is owned first. So this concept, this public imagination of China or any other country, Japan, is stealing US technology, it reflects a certain mindset that somehow knowledge is this kind of finite resource that once it is being acquired or accessed by someone else, it is a loss to the self. And that is a fundamentally not just wrong, but dangerous mindset, as we've seen over the COVID-19 pandemic, that nations like the human body are all porous entities, and no one is safe unless everyone is safe. No one is safe unless the most marginalized, most vulnerable members of a society are protected. So unless we change this fundamental mindset, we are going to force ourselves into these logical corners and cling onto some artificial divisions in the form of a border to affirm our position, and that is dangerous, and that would be less hopeful than the capacious, flourishing future that we should all deserve.
Dr. Chu, any thoughts?
Well, I agree with most of what Yangyang said. I think I want to add a little personal thing about scientific. Yes, U.S. science is very, very strong, but the perception that Chinese science is still in the backwater is not fully true. And in a couple of instances in the last couple of years, we've had, we asked for materials of someone we know in China, they give them to us. It's not even a formal collaboration. They're not asking why. One or two of these instances, it led to a patent, but their name is not on the patent or on the paper. And similarly, I always felt free if I could help some other person in any country or any other place, that this is what you do, okay? And the public doesn't understand that there's a lot of that going on, or there used to be a lot of it going on, but it seems to be being squashed, right? And that's something that I wish, I think only scientists might understand, that there's a level of cooperation and willingness to give advice and to help other people in their research, where you're not demanding co-authorship, you're not demanding share of intellectual property rights, you're not demanding anything. And do we want governments to try to squash this? And again, eventually it's all published. And so we're not talking about proprietary research, we're not talking about classified research. And the only issue is, do people have improper early knowledge before they should?
Yeah, and even just sort of one of the things that's been discussed in my work with the scientific community, which I've greatly enjoyed, I just wish it wasn't necessary, is about, so what are sort of the normal academic things that researchers and academics in general do? They write letters of recommendation, they do tenure review files, they give speeches, and making sure that there's a safe harbor, that it's clear what is sort of normal academic collaboration that doesn't even get close to touching any areas of national security, and so of educating of policymakers of how academia works. And here I want to turn back to Eileen Guo. We got a question about looking at holding funding agencies accountable, but also universities. And one thing that I find interesting is how universities are not monolithic entities, that there's often different incentives on the part of the administration and the faculty. And you have a general counsel's office, which job is to protect the university, which sometimes means not maybe being the best advocates for the faculty. And certainly with Professor Yangyang Cheng, my sense is he was unique in having MIT fully fund his legal bills. And they had lawyers for Professor Chen, and they had separate counsel for the university itself at, I'm sure, a very high cost. But most of the researchers who have been, academics who have been investigated and prosecuted, have been shouldering those costs themselves with no support from their universities. And then even if they are cleared, they still have not just the financial toll, but of course the emotional and sometimes physical toll. So I'm just wondering if you've been able to see, are there pushes to try to get more accountability, not just from universities, but from the grant-making agencies, and what sort of steps could be taken to try to chart a better path, because these cases aren't going to go away entirely.
Yeah, I can speak a little bit more to the university side, but one of the things that we have been starting to see through the cases that we tracked is that there's a pretty big difference between whether or not a case even, let me back up. There's a pretty big difference between whether an investigation turns into something more based on how the university responds. And so I spoke to a former investigator for the NSF that told me that, how he even approaches a university is very different based on a whole host of factors, including if a university has a faculty senate, if it has a strong faculty senate, if he already has relationships with individuals in the office that oversees how grants are run, and compliance is dealt with. So there's all of these different factors that come into play. And one of the things that we've also seen with some of these cases that have been prosecuted and have been announced later on is that community members have been rallying around professors, and at some points it comes earlier, at some points it comes later, and that also seems to not have a factor necessarily on the outcome of the case, but it certainly has an outcome for the professor and for how the university is being viewed within the community. And I think just going off of Yangyang's earlier point about the mobilization that has happened around this, I think that's a factor that hasn't gotten enough attention and is something that for future activists and people that are concerned about this issue is something to think about in your communities.
Thoughts from other panelists? Or
You all, your comment about faculty senate is very timely. I'm a member of the Senate and the Senate Steering Committee, and we just had major part of 4 faculty meetings discussing conflict of interest and conflict of commitment, which was driven by federal agencies. And many of us feel that settling to the lowest common denominator, the Christopher Wray's, the NIH things, is just the wrong thing to do. If they insist on doing it, the faculty and the universities have to comply, but to just bend to the more extreme versions that are not official policy is something that some universities do and others push back. MIT is a shining example of pushing back in a very important way. And I wish more universities would do that rather than just saying, okay, if that's what they want, that's what they want. And oh, by the way, if one agency wants this and the other agency wants that, we'll just go to the common denominator and we'll require all the faculty, regardless who they're being funded, to comply. And what that is it just increases the amount of requirements of compliance and other things, and not really addressing the concerns of intellectual property theft.
If I may comment quickly, I think another issue with regards to this differentiation in terms of response from universities that have individual members of their communities being implicated in the China initiative is it reflected the disparities within academia itself. Like it's a very unique case, as Eileen mentioned, with Professor Yang Cheng at MIT, but it takes like a senior scientist well respected in his community and an extremely rich elite institution like MIT that has this kind of resources. Like for a state school with a certain kind of a contentious relationship with the state legislature, for example, and also other forms of institutions, and also like in terms of academia itself, the kind of stratification of academic labor. So for a tenured professor has different kinds of protection compared with non-tenured or adjunct on faculty, let alone graduate student. And Professor Yang Cheng is a naturalized U.S. citizen for international members who are implicated. And so I think what is very important is to reflect on when we see positive examples, to see how much of that is dependent on these ad hoc elements in terms of individual administrators' goodwill or individual prestige or individual connections, and really see how that is unreliable and how academic community can organize in a way that codifies these kinds of support so that any individual who are unfairly implicated in these kinds of government initiatives can enjoy similar levels of protection.
Yeah, and on this point of the having, of course, you're going to have conflict of interest and policies that's necessary, and how to shape those and to make them so that they are not so onerous in a way that isn't necessary, that it essentially becomes decoupling by bureaucracy, that to get through the bureaucratic hoops, you're spending more time on the paperwork than you are on the project that you were trying to pursue. So I see that as one of the challenges going forward as well, the sort of streamlining to make it so people can, who are working on, whether it be hydrogels or nanotechnology, have space to do that and not just worry about, are they complying with the grants, and is it worth getting those government grants? Because I've also heard a number of people who are saying, I'm just shying away, in particular from getting grants, maybe government in general or from certain agencies. And we have just a few minutes left here. And one thing that's come up too is, again and again in our conversation is advocacy. And again, I've been so happy to see groups like ACLU and the Brennan Center that aren't focused on Asian American, Pacific Islander communities really involved too, because these are issues that should not be on the shoulders of the communities of people of Chinese descent or AAPI more generally, because it affects everyone's civil liberties. And this goes back to, of course, similar concerns or related after 9/11 with different communities that have ties to certain foreign countries of concern. And so here, most of the people watching today are not scientists and not investigative journalists. And so I always want to end on a kind of a hopeful note that, one thing with the China initiative was a lot of people just didn't even know it existed, right? And so going forward, because we don't want to just say, woo, done with that, like, everything's fine and dandy, because it's not. What advice would you give for people who are watching and want to help, whether it be with encouraging better immigration policies to get talent, whether it be with trying to increase support for science, because we do need more scientists that are homegrown in the US too. Any thoughts about how people can be productive and helpful in this longer term effort?
Well, let me begin. I'll try to be very brief. I was part of a committee report called Rising Above the Gathering Storm. And in that report, and we spent a lot of time, the question put before the committee by Congress was, what can the United States do to flourish in an ever flat, ever competitive world? And in particular, in a much more competitive science and technology world. And one of the things we said is anybody who gets a PhD, who's a foreign student who gets a PhD in an American university should have the green card stapled to their diploma. I haven't really changed from that. I may have changed it, well, maybe the upper half. but I think the United States has benefited so much from immigrant graduate students or postdocs who came to the United States for many, many reasons, stayed in the United States and raised their families in the United States, and added to all the things that, like computers and semiconductors and all this stuff. And so we are in danger of threatening that supply, and this anti-Chinese thing is being felt and seen. Well, the United States, even to Europeans, is not the welcoming country we thought it was or used to be. And so that's something else that, on an optimistic note, I would hope that the Congress and current and future administration will recognize how much the United States has benefited from this. And even if they go back to their original countries, there is a deeper appreciation, understanding of our country. But for the most part, they stay.
Yeah, and if I may, I think, well, migration is a human right, so anyone should be free to leave and free to stay, regardless of their profession and level of education. And so I think on that point, it also relates to, for the China initiative, any individual, like for example, people in this audience or anyone, this is not just something that affects people of Chinese origin or people who are in science or academic researchers, because it touches on so many issues like immigration policy, like race, like criminal justice, like academic freedom, like the role of access to science and technology and intellectual property, and in general, how we imagine future and relationships between nations and between individuals and institutions. And so I think what is really important is for any person to see them, to reflect on their own roles in these intertwined webs of power and oppression and systemic injustices, and to really reflect on their own complicities, recognize their responsibility, organize and leverage their power.
Yangyang really said everything that I wanted to say, but in a much more poetic way. I think everyone can do a lot to make the environment here more open and more equitable. And so I think really that's what everyone should be doing at a baseline.
Well, with that, I want to thank all of our panelists. I want to thank the National Committee and everyone who's been working behind the scenes to make this webinar happen. It is not going to be the last webinar on these issues, that I am sure. And I just really want to encourage people to stay involved, because talk to your members of Congress, write them, because there is a lot that is being decided right now that will have ramifications for years to come, because especially when something is baked into a law, it's hard to change. And so with that, my role as moderator is done. It's been a joy.